The throne room of the Veliari Dominion stretched so far and so high that clouds could have formed under its ceiling, and the walls were carved from black stone that hummed with ancient energy, and every surface was decorated with the bones and banners of 100 conquered worlds. Queen Silthari sat on her throne like a living weapon, towering 9 feet tall, with an exoskeleton that shimmered like polished obsidian, and her 4 arms rested on the armrests with a casual grace that hid the deadly strength in each limb, and her mandibles clicked softly as she watched the parade of tribute-bearers approach her with offerings from across the galaxy. She was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, perfect and terrifying and built for a single purpose. Today was Tribute Day, and species from dozens of conquered worlds came forward one by one to lay their gifts at her feet. And there were crystals from the ice world of Dren, living metals from the forges of Calith, and biosilk, woven by the enslaved Voss. And Silthari accepted each tribute with a slow nod of her angular head, her compound eyes reflecting every trembling servant that knelt before her. Warlord Draxon stood to her left, her chief military advisor, a scarred mountain of chitin and muscle, who had personally led the conquest of 11 star systems. And he watched the proceedings with barely hidden contempt, as if the ceremony bored him, as if he had better things to do than stand beside his queen. Then the slavers arrived, a consortium of Grethki traders, small, gray-skinned creatures with too many teeth and not enough conscience, dragged their cargo into the throne room in hovering containment pods, and inside each pod was a newly captured species, specimens taken from the edges of explored space, for sale to the highest bidder. Silthari leaned forward with mild interest, as the Grethki leader, a hunched creature named Vilkas, bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. "Your Magnificence," Vilkas hissed, his voice dripping with rehearsed flattery. "We bring you the rarest finds from the uncharted sectors, a thornback from the jungle moons, a pair of crystalline singers from the Vaith Nebula, and 1 specimen from a newly catalogued world on the far fringe." He gestured to the last containment pod with a dramatic sweep of his clawed hand, and the pod door slid open. Out stepped a human. The throne room fell silent for exactly 2 seconds, and then the laughter began. He was short by Veliari standards, barely 6 feet tall, with no armor, no claws, no tail, no venom glands, no bioluminescence, no natural weapons of any kind, and his skin was soft and pale, and looked like it would tear if you breathed on it too hard. And his body was lean but unremarkable, wrapped in the torn remnants of a gray military uniform. His name was Sergeant Ethan Cole, and he stood in the center of the most powerful throne room in the galaxy, with his hands bound in energy cuffs, surrounded by creatures that could kill him with a casual backhand. And he did not flinch. Silthari tilted her massive head and studied the creature before her, with the same expression one might give a small insect that had wandered onto a dining table. Curiosity mixed with faint amusement. "What is this?" she asked, her voice resonating through the chamber like a struck bell. "A human, Your Magnificence," Vilkas replied eagerly, "from a species recently discovered in the Outer Rim. Tier 9 classification, the lowest rank. Their homeworld is unremarkable. Their technology is primitive by galactic standards, and their bodies are—" He paused and gestured at Ethan with an apologetic shrug. "Well, as you can see, they are quite fragile." More laughter rippled through the court, and Draxon let out a low growl of amusement that shook the air. "Tier 9, Draxon rumbled, his scarred mandibles spreading in what passed for a grin among his kind. "I have fought bacteria more impressive than this creature. Why do you waste the Queen's time with vermin, slaver?" Vilkas flinched but pressed on, his merchant instincts overriding his fear. "He could serve as an attendant, Your Magnificence, a novelty, something to amuse the court." Humans are said to be obedient and clever in the way that small animals can sometimes be clever. And this one was found among a group of soldiers, though what sort of army would recruit such a species is beyond my understanding. Silthari rose from her throne and descended the steps with slow, deliberate grace, each footfall sending a tremor through the stone floor. And she stopped directly in front of Ethan and looked down at him the way a mountain looks down at a pebble. Ethan looked up at her. His expression was calm and still, like the surface of water that hid deep currents, and his brown eyes moved across her face. Without fear, without defiance, without anything that the Velyari court could read or interpret. "Do you understand me, small creature?" Silthari asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice quiet and steady. The simplicity of his answer caught her off guard for half a moment, and then she smiled, or made the Velyari equivalent of a smile, her mandibles parting slightly. "I will keep him," she announced to the court, and she said it the way someone might say they had decided to keep an unusual stone they found on a walk, with casual passing interest. Vilkos bowed and collected his payment, and Draxon shook his head with visible disgust. "My queen," Draxon said, stepping forward, "keeping alien pets is beneath your station. This creature is worthless. It cannot fight. It cannot serve any meaningful purpose, and its presence in the palace is an insult to—" "I have made my decision, Draxon," Silthari interrupted, and her tone carried the kind of weight that ended conversations permanently. Draxon fell silent, but his eyes lingered on Ethan with something darker than contempt, something that looked like a warning, or perhaps a promise. Ethan was escorted to a small chamber near the Queen's personal quarters, a room meant for servants of no importance, with bare walls and a thin sleeping mat, and a single window that overlooked the vast military courtyard below. The guards who brought him there did not bother to lock the door, because where would a Tier 9 creature possibly go, and what could it possibly do? They left him alone, and the moment he was alone, the mask shifted. Ethan moved to the window and stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the courtyard below with a focus that would have alarmed anyone paying attention. And in the span of 15 minutes, he counted the guard patrols. 4 rotations, 12 soldiers each, 6-minute intervals between shifts, and he noted the weapons they carried. Vex 7 plasma rifles with a 3-second charge delay between shots. He turned from the window and surveyed his room, running his fingers along the walls until he found what he was looking for. A maintenance panel behind the sleeping mat, held in place by magnetic bolts, and behind it was a junction box connected to the palace's internal communication grid. He reached into the torn lining of his uniform collar and pulled out a small chip, a microtransmitter he had palmed from the containment pod during the walk to the throne room, and he held it up to the faint light and studied it for a moment before placing it against the junction box. Then he sat down on the sleeping mat and closed his eyes. And behind those closed eyes, a map was forming. Corridors, stairwells, power conduits, guard stations. Every detail he had absorbed during his walk through the palace was being filed and organized and stored with the precision of a machine. Sergeant Ethan Cole had been a prisoner for less than 6 hours, and he already knew more about the palace's infrastructure than most of the people who lived in it. Somewhere above him, Queen Silthari settled back onto her throne and forgot about her new pet almost immediately, because he was small and soft and utterly unremarkable. And in her experience, small and soft things did not survive long in the Dominion. She had no way of knowing how wrong she was. She had no way of knowing that she had just invited a predator into her home. Not the kind with claws and fangs, but something far worse. The kind that watched and waited and planned. The kind that turned patience into a weapon and silence into a strategy. The kind that her empire had never encountered before. And by the time she understood what Ethan Cole truly was, everything would have already changed. 3 weeks passed inside the Velari royal palace, and in that time, Ethan Cole became invisible in the way that only truly dangerous things can become invisible, by being exactly what everyone expected him to be. He carried documents for the Queen, organized her War Council's intelligence reports, cleaned her chambers, and stood quietly in the corner during meetings with his head bowed and his hands folded, and not a single Velari in the palace gave him a second glance, because he was small and soft and harmless, and small, soft, harmless things were not worth noticing. But behind those downcast eyes, a war was being fought in silence. Every day, Ethan walked the same corridors, and every day he noticed something new. The hairline crack in the eastern wall that meant the stone had settled unevenly and could be breached with enough focused pressure. The blind spot in the security grid near the third-floor maintenance shaft. The fact that the plasma turrets in the throne room ran on a separate power loop that could be isolated and disabled from the sub-basement. He memorized it all, and he never wrote any of it down, because a written record could be found, but a mind trained to hold battlefield intelligence could not be searched. The Queen barely noticed him most days, and when she did notice him, it was with the vague amusement of someone watching a small animal perform a trick. But small things began to change. It started with the intelligence reports, because the Velari War Council generated enormous volumes of data from their conquered territories. Troop movements, resource allocations, diplomatic communications, and the filing system was a disaster of redundancy and contradiction that 3 Velari analysts had failed to organize properly. Ethan reorganized the entire archive in 4 days. He did it without being asked, without drawing attention, without changing anything dramatic. He simply rearranged the data into a logical structure that made patterns visible at a glance. And when Silthari opened her morning briefing packet and found that she could actually understand the strategic landscape of her own empire for the first time in months, she paused. "Who did this?" she asked her chief of staff. "The human, Your Magnificence." Silthari said nothing, but she looked at Ethan across the room with an expression that was one shade different from her usual indifference. The faintest flicker of something that might have been curiosity. Then there was the matter of language. The Velari spoke a complex tonal language with over 12,000 root words and a grammar structure that shifted based on the speaker's social rank. And most conquered species took years to learn even basic conversational phrases, and some never learned it at all. Ethan was fluent in 6 weeks. He simply began responding to commands before they were fully translated by the palace's interpreter drones. And one day, Silthari gave him an order in rapid high dialect Velari, the formal tongue reserved for royalty, and Ethan responded in the same dialect without hesitation. Silthari's mandibles clicked once in surprise, and she stared at him for a long moment, before turning away. "Interesting," she murmured, and that single word carried more weight than she intended. It was during the 5th week that Ethan found his most important ally. Corvan was a Dren, one of the reptilian species that the Velari had conquered 2 generations ago, and he worked in the palace armory, maintaining weapons he was forbidden to use, repairing armor he was forbidden to wear, and living in a small cell beneath the forge that smelled of metal and defeat. He was strong, stronger than most Velari in fact, with thick scaled skin and powerful limbs built for combat. But the fight had been beaten out of him long ago, not through violence but through something worse, the slow, grinding certainty that resistance was impossible and that his people would never be free. Ethan found him one evening while delivering a requisition order to the armory, and he stood in the doorway and watched Corvan work for a full minute before speaking. "You sharpen their blades better than they deserve," Ethan said quietly. Corvan looked up with dull yellow eyes that held no spark and no hope. "It is my function," the Dren replied. "No," Ethan said, stepping closer. "It is what they told you your function is. Those are not the same thing." Corvan stared at him, and something stirred behind those dead eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of what hope used to feel like. Over the following days, Ethan returned to the armory again and again, always with a legitimate reason, a delivery, a question about a maintenance schedule, request for a replacement tool, and each time he stayed a little longer, and each time the conversation went a little deeper. He learned that Korriban had access to every weapon schematic in the Valari military, that he knew the structural weaknesses of their armor better than the engineers who designed it, and that somewhere beneath all that resignation, there was still a warrior who remembered what it meant to fight. Ethan did not push. He simply listened, and he asked questions, and he treated Korriban like a person instead of a tool, and that alone was revolutionary in a palace where subjugated species were furniture. Meanwhile, in the upper levels of the palace, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Ethan had noticed it in the intelligence reports, subtle inconsistencies that the Valari analysts had overlooked because they were not trained to think like a threat analyst. But Ethan was, and the patterns were unmistakable. Troop reallocations in the outer provinces that did not match any active campaign orders. Encrypted communications on frequencies that were not part of the standard military grid. Loyalty purges among mid-level commanders that targeted anyone known to be personally devoted to the Queen. And supply shipments being rerouted to staging areas that had no strategic value unless someone was planning to use them as a launch point for an attack on the capital. Was building an army within the army, and he was preparing to take the throne. Ethan said nothing about this to anyone, not yet, because information was a weapon, and weapons were most effective when deployed at exactly the right moment. Instead, he continued to play his role, continued to be small and quiet and harmless, continued to bow his head and carry documents and stand in corners. And then Silthari decided to test him. It happened one evening when the Queen was restless and bored, and she summoned Ethan to her private chambers and gestured toward a table where a complex strategy game was laid out. Verath, the Valari game of war, played on a hexagonal board with pieces that represented armies and resources and political influence. "Play with me," she commanded, and it was not a request. Ethan sat across from her, studied the board, and lost the first game in 12 moves. He lost the second game in 20 moves, lasted 40 moves before falling. By the fifth game, he won. Silthari stared at the board in silence for a very long time, her compound eyes tracing and retracing the sequence of moves that had dismantled her strategy from the inside out. Not with brute force, but with patience, with misdirection, with a series of small sacrifices that had seemed meaningless at the time, but which had collectively destroyed her position before she realized what was happening. "How?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than Ethan had ever heard it. "I watched you play the first 4 games," Ethan replied, "and I learned how you think." Silthari leaned back and studied him the way she might study a weapon she had never seen before, with caution and respect and something that was almost unease. "What are humans known for?" she asked suddenly, and there was genuine curiosity beneath the question, something more than idle amusement. Ethan met her eyes, those vast, compound eyes that could see in spectrums he could not imagine, and he answered simply, "Endurance, Your Majesty. We do not stop." She found the answer quaint and almost charming, and she dismissed him with a wave of her hand. And she told herself that he was simply clever for a lesser species, that his victories in the game were flukes, that there was nothing remarkable about a creature who could learn patterns. Even trained animals could do that. But that night, for the first time since she had purchased him, Queen Silthari dreamed about the human, and in the dream he was standing in a dark room with his back to her, and when he turned around his eyes were not the eyes of a servant or a pet. They were the eyes of something that had been watching her from the very beginning. She woke with her heart's beating fast, and she told herself it was nothing. In the outer provinces, Draxon's fleet completed its final repositioning, and his loyal commanders sent their confirmation signals on encrypted channels that they believed no one was monitoring. They were wrong. In his small chamber near the Queen's quarters, Ethan Cole sat in the dark and listened to every transmission, because he had cracked their encryption 3 days ago using the communication chip he had stolen on his first night in the palace. And he now knew the exact date and time of the coming attack. War was coming to the throne world, not from outside the Dominion, but from within. And the only person in the entire palace who understood what was about to happen was the one person that everyone had decided was not worth worrying about. Ethan closed his eyes and began to plan, because that was what humans did. They watched, they waited, they endured, and when the moment came, they acted with a precision that shook worlds. The moment was almost here. The attack came at the darkest hour of the Valari night cycle, when the twin moons of the throne world aligned behind the planet's shadow, and the sky turned the color of old blood. Explosions tore through the orbital defense stations first. 3 simultaneous detonations that turned the rings of steel and fire that protected the capital into spinning debris fields. And before the alarms could even finish their first wail, Draxon's warships dropped out of hyperspace directly above the city like a fist slamming down on an open palm. The palace shook. Silthari was in her private chambers when the first blast hit, and the force of it threw her sideways into the wall, and for a moment all she could hear was the scream of twisting metal and the deep thunderous roar of warships firing on the city's shield generators. Her personal guard, 6 elite warriors in full ceremonial armor, burst through the doors within seconds, their weapons drawn and their compound eyes wide with a panic. They were trying very hard to hide. "Your Magnificence, the outer defenses are gone," the guard captain reported, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Warlord Draxon's forces have seized the communication towers and the eastern barracks. His commanders are broadcasting demands for your surrender on all channels." Silthari stood to her full height, and even in chaos, she was magnificent. A queen who had ruled an empire for 40 years, who had crushed rebellions and conquered star systems, who had never once shown weakness in the face of any threat. But this was different. This was not an external enemy she could rally her forces against. This was a knife in the back from her own most trusted general. And as report after report came flooding in, Commander Yelthos had defected, the Third Fleet had turned, the Senate Guard had been massacred in their barracks. The scope of the betrayal became horrifyingly clear. Draxon had been planning this for years, not weeks, and he had turned half of her military against her, without her ever suspecting a thing. "How many remain loyal to us?" she demanded. The guard captain hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "Perhaps 200 in the palace, Your Magnificence. The rest are either dead, captured, or have joined Draxon." 200 out of an army of millions. Silthari felt something she had not felt in decades, a cold, creeping sensation in her thorax that she barely recognized because she had never had a reason to feel it before. It was fear. Another explosion rocked the palace, closer this time. Dust and fragments of ancient stone rained down from the ceiling, and through the window Silthari could see Draxon's heavy assault vehicles rolling through the streets of her capital, while her own citizens fled in every direction. "We must reach the inner sanctum," the guard captain said. "The walls there are reinforced. We can hold out until—" "Until what?" Silthari snapped. "Until help arrives from commanders who have already betrayed us. Until our fleet returns from campaigns on the other side of the galaxy. There is no rescue coming, Captain." The guard captain had no answer for that, because she was right, and they all knew it. They moved through the palace corridors in a tight formation, the 6 guards surrounding Silthari with weapons raised, and twice they encountered squads of Draxon's soldiers, elite shock troops in black armor, with the warlord's crimson sigil painted across their chests. And twice, the guards fought them off, but at a cost. The time they reached the inner sanctum, they had lost 2 warriors, and the remaining 4 were injured. The inner sanctum was a vast circular chamber at the heart of the palace, built centuries ago as a last refuge for the royal bloodline, with walls 3 meters thick and blast doors that could withstand orbital bombardment. And it was here that Silthari's remaining loyal advisors had gathered, 14 in total, a mix of bureaucrats and minor officials who looked like they were attending their own funerals. And there, standing quietly in the corner with his hands at his sides and his expression perfectly calm, was Ethan Cole. Silthari barely registered his presence. She had far more pressing concerns, and the human was the least important thing in the room. "Seal the doors," she commanded, and the blast doors groaned shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin closing. For several minutes, her advisors argued. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to attempt an escape through the underground tunnels. Some simply sat in silence, with the hollow look of people who had already given up. And their voices overlapped and contradicted each other and accomplished nothing. Silthari listened to them with growing frustration, because Valari doctrine had no framework for this situation. A queen was supposed to be untouchable, unchallengeable, supreme, and her entire military culture was built on the assumption that the throne was eternal, and now that assumption had been shattered, and no one in the room knew what to do. It was the guard captain who finally voiced the truth that everyone was avoiding. "Your Magnificence, we cannot hold this chamber indefinitely. Draxon will breach these doors within hours. We need a strategy, and we need it now." Silence fell, and in that silence, every pair of compound eyes in the room stared at the queen, waiting for her to produce a miracle. She had none. "I can help." The voice was quiet, steady, and completely out of place, and every head in the room turned toward the corner where the human stood. Ethan Cole stepped forward into the center of the room, and something about the way he moved was different. Not the shuffling gait of a servant, but the controlled stride of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Silthari looked down at him with an expression that mixed confusion and irritation in equal measure. "You," she said. "You are an attendant, a Tier 9 pet. What could you possibly?" "Draxon has 12,000 soldiers in the capital," Ethan said, cutting her off mid-sentence, and the room went rigid with shock, because no one interrupted the queen. No one ever. They are deployed in 3 concentric rings around the palace, with the heaviest concentration at the main gates and the eastern courtyard. His command post is in the old Senate building 4 blocks north, and he is using encrypted channel Theta 7 for all tactical communications. His supply lines run through the southern transit hub, and they are guarded by a single company of reserve troops because he does not expect anyone to know about them. The silence that followed was absolute. Silthari stared at him, and for the first time since she had purchased him, she truly saw him. Not the small body, not the soft skin, not the gentle voice, but the eyes. And in those eyes there was a cold, razor-sharp intelligence that she had somehow missed entirely. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "Because I have been watching," Ethan replied. "I have been watching since the day I arrived. Palace infrastructure in my first week. I cracked Draxon's encrypted communications 3 days ago. I identified his loyalists, his supply chains, his tactical weaknesses, and his blind spots. I have been gathering intelligence while your advisors were gathering dust." Draxon's artillery fired again, and the chamber trembled, and somewhere above them a section of ceiling collapsed, with a sound like the world ending. "Why?" Silthari asked, and it was not a strategic question. It was personal, and she needed to understand why this creature she had treated as furniture was now offering to save her life. Ethan met her gaze without flinching. Because Draxon will be worse for everyone. For your people, for the subjugated species, for every world in the Dominion. And because where I come from, we do not sit quietly and wait to die. Silthari looked at her advisors, who stared back at her with nothing to offer. And she looked at her wounded guards, brave, but had no plan. And she looked at the blast doors that would not hold forever. And then she looked at the human. "What do you need?" she asked. Ethan allowed himself the smallest shadow of a smile. Not warm, not friendly, but the grim, satisfied expression of a predator whose trap had finally been set. "Your trust," he said, "and a weapon." A fallen guard's plasma blade lay on the floor near the door, dropped during the retreat, and Ethan walked to it and picked it up and tested its weight with a practiced motion that spoke of years of training and thousands of hours of combat experience. The blade hummed in his hand, as if it recognized what he was. He turned to face the room, and in that moment, standing in the dim emergency lighting of the besieged sanctum, with a weapon in his hand and fire in his eyes, Ethan Cole did not look small anymore. He did not look weak. He did not look like a pet or a servant or a Tier 9. He looked like exactly what he was, a human soldier who had been playing the longest game in the room, and who was now ready to show the most powerful empire in the galaxy what his species could do when they stopped pretending. "Stay behind me," he said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had given orders in the dark before. "This is what my species does." Silthari, queen of the Velari Dominion, ruler of 1,000 worlds, looked at the small creature standing between her and the end of everything, and for the first time in her long and terrible reign, she did as she was told. Ethan moved through the palace like a ghost that had memorized every shadow. He led them through maintenance corridors that did not appear on any official schematic, passages he had discovered during weeks of quiet exploration while carrying documents and running errands for a queen who never once asked where he went between tasks. And the corridors were narrow enough that the Velyari soldiers had to move single file, which made the towering warriors uncomfortable. But Ethan did not slow down, and he did not explain, because there was no time for comfort. Silthari followed directly behind him, ducking her massive frame through doorways that were never built for Velyari royalty, and she watched the back of his head with an expression that shifted between bewilderment and something she refused to name. They had been moving for 7 minutes when Ethan raised his fist in a sharp gesture that meant stop, and every soldier behind him froze instantly, because there was something in the way he commanded that bypassed rank and species and went straight to the part of the brain that understood authority. "6 soldiers," Ethan whispered. "Other side of this junction. Vex 7 rifles. 3-second charge delay between shots. When I open this door, stay back and do not move until I say." The guard captain leaned forward, with doubt written across his scarred face. "You cannot fight 6 Velari warriors alone, human. They will tear you apart in—" Ethan opened the door. What happened next took 11 seconds, and it would be talked about in the palace for generations. Ethan did not charge. He stepped calmly into the junction and slammed his palm against the environmental control panel on the wall, and the gravity in the corridor shifted violently, a modification he had pre-programmed 3 days ago during a routine walk past this exact junction. And the 6 Velari soldiers, each weighing over 400 pounds in their armor, were suddenly lifted off the floor and slammed into the ceiling with a crunch that echoed down the hallway. Before they could recover, Ethan hit the pressure door controls, and 3 reinforced blast doors slammed shut in rapid sequence, isolating 4 of the soldiers in separate sealed compartments. The remaining 2 crashed back to the floor as gravity normalized, and they scrambled for their weapons with the speed and fury of elite warriors who had been trained to kill since birth. Ethan was faster. He closed the distance before the first soldier could raise his rifle. Dropped low beneath the sweeping arc of a clawed hand, drove the plasma blade up through the gap between the chest plate and the shoulder guard, a weakness in Velari armor that Corvan had described to him in exact detail, and twisted. The soldier fell. The second soldier fired, and the plasma bolt scorched the air, where Ethan's head had been half a second earlier. But Ethan had already moved, rolling sideways and ripping a power conduit from the wall with his bare hands, and jamming it into the soldier's exposed neck joint, and the electrical discharge dropped the warrior like a puppet with cut strings. 11 seconds, start to finish. Ethan stood in the smoking corridor, breathing hard but steady, the plasma blade humming in his hand, surrounded by fallen warriors twice his size, and he turned back to the group still standing frozen in the doorway. "Move," he said. Sothari stepped through the door and looked at the bodies, and then looked at Ethan, and her compound eyes were very wide, and she said, "Nothing," because there were no words in her language for what she had just witnessed. They kept moving. As they descended toward the lower levels, Ethan spoke quickly and clearly, laying out a plan that was unlike anything the Velari had ever encountered in their centuries of warfare. "Draxon's forces are trained for one thing," Ethan explained as they moved. "Overwhelming force in direct confrontation. They hit hard, they hold ground, they push forward. It is all they know, and it is all they expect. We are not going to give them a direct confrontation." He turned to the guard captain. "How many subjugated species are housed in the palace service levels?" The captain blinked, confused by the question. "Several hundred. Dren, Kalith, Voss, they are servants and laborers. They are not fighters." "They were fighters before your empire broke them," Ethan replied, and there was no accusation in his voice, only fact. "Going to remember." They reached the service levels, and Ethan moved through the cramped quarters where the subjugated species lived, the forgotten backbone of the Veliari palace, and he found Corvan first. The Dren was standing in the armory, with a weapon in each hand, not because anyone had told him to arm himself, but because he had heard the explosions and felt the shaking, and some ancient instinct had overridden decades of obedience. "Corvan," Ethan said. The Dren looked at him, and this time there was a spark in those yellow eyes, small and fragile but real. "Is it time?" Corvan asked. "It is time." Ethan moved from group to group, the Dren laborers, the Kalith engineers, the Voss weavers, and he spoke to each of them, not with grand speeches or dramatic promises, but with simple words that cut through years of submission like a blade for silk. "They told you that you were nothing," he said, standing before a gathered crowd of 100 tired and frightened faces from a dozen conquered species. "They told you that you were weak, that you were less, that you existed only to serve. But tonight, the ones who told you that are fighting each other, and the walls they built to keep you down are cracking. Tonight you have a choice. You can stay here in the dark and wait for whoever wins to decide your fate, or you can pick up a weapon and decide it for yourselves." He paused and looked across the crowd, and he saw the fear in their eyes, and he understood it, because he knew what it was like to be underestimated and dismissed, and told that your kind did not matter. "I am a human," he said, "and 2 months ago the queen of this empire bought me as a pet, because she thought I was the weakest thing in the galaxy. Tonight I am going to prove her wrong, and you can prove them wrong with me." Corvan was the first to step forward, and then a young Kalith engineer, and then a Voss worker with scars on her arms from years of labor, and then another, and another, until the entire crowd was standing, and the fear in their eyes had been replaced by something hotter and brighter and far more dangerous. Ethan armed them from the palace armory. Corvan knew every weapon in the stockpile and distributed them with the efficiency of someone who had been secretly preparing for this moment for years. And within 30 minutes, Ethan had a force of 140 fighters organized into 4 strike teams. He gave each team a specific target: communications, power grid, armory resupply routes, and the main gate. And he gave each team leader a set of instructions, so precise and so detailed that they sounded like they had been planned for months, not improvised in a burning palace. Do not engage in direct combat, Ethan told them. Hit them where they are not looking. Disable their equipment, collapse their supply lines, set traps and fall back. Shadows. Make them afraid of every corridor and every doorway. Make them spend 10 soldiers to secure every room. It was guerrilla warfare, a concept so alien to Valeri military doctrine that Draxun's commanders had no name for it and no defense against it. The counterattack began. Korvan led a Dren strike team into the armory complex and seized control of the weapons depot, cutting off Draxun's ability to resupply his forces inside the palace. And when a company of shock troops was sent to retake it, they found every doorway rigged with improvised explosive devices made from power cells and cleaning chemicals. Combinations that no Valeri would ever have thought to create, but which Ethan had designed in his head during long nights of quiet planning. The Caliph engineers targeted the power grid, surgically cutting power to the sections of the palace that Draxun's forces controlled, while keeping the lights on in the areas held by the Loyalists. Psychological effect was devastating. Draxun's elite soldiers, accustomed to dominance and control, found themselves stumbling through darkness, while their enemies moved freely in the light. Ethan personally led the assault on the communications tower, taking 5 fighters with him up a ventilation shaft that was too small for full-grown Valeri, but perfectly sized for a human. And he emerged behind the enemy position and disabled the tower's primary transmitter before the guards even knew he was there. Then he did something brilliant. He reactivated the transmitter on a system-wide broadcast frequency and uploaded the files he had been collecting for weeks. Encrypted communications between Draxun and his co-conspirators, evidence of bribery and assassination orders, proof that the warlord had murdered loyal commanders and replaced them with puppets, and he broadcast all of it to every ship, every station, and every military outpost in the Dominion. Minutes. Fence-sitting commanders across the Empire, who had been waiting to see which side would win, suddenly found themselves looking at irrefutable proof that Draxun was a traitor and a murderer, and one by one they declared for the Queen. The tide turned. Draxun, raging in his command post, ordered a full assault on the throne room, a final brutal push to capture or kill Silthari before her forces could regroup. And he led the charge himself, because he was a warlord, and warlords did not hide behind their soldiers. He smashed through the palace gates with 200 of his best warriors and stormed through the corridors toward the throne room, expecting to find a cowering queen and a handful of wounded guards. Instead, he found Ethan Cole standing alone in the center of the throne room, the plasma blade in his hand, casting blue light across his face. Draxun stopped and stared, and then he laughed, a deep, booming sound that shook the walls. Chandeliers. This is what stands between me and the throne, Draxun bellowed. A human, a soft pink Tier 9 insect. I will crush you with one hand, little creature. He just shifted his weight slightly, settling into a stance that Draxun did not recognize. The warlord charged. He was fast, terrifyingly fast for something his size, and his first strike would have split Ethan in half if it had landed. But Ethan was not where Draxun expected him to be, because Ethan had spent 5 games of Varath learning exactly how the Valeri mind worked. Aggressive, direct, and incapable of anticipating an enemy who refused to stand and fight. Ethan dodged and moved and baited, drawing Draxun deeper into the throne room, letting the warlord's fury build with every missed strike, letting his arrogance blind him to the trap that was closing around him. The structural supports that Ethan had weakened hours ago. the floor panels that had been loosened, the gravity generator beneath the throne that had been reprogrammed. Draxon lunged one final time, and Ethan sidestepped and triggered the gravity trap. Became his prison, as the localized gravity field increased tenfold, and drove him to his knees, his armor cracking, his limbs pinned to the floor by a force he could not overcome. Ethan stepped forward, and pressed the plasma blade against Draxon's throat. "Yield," he said. The warlord looked up at the human standing over him, this small, soft, impossible creature, and for the first time in his life, Draxon knew what it felt like to lose. The throne room doors opened, and Silthari entered, flanked by her surviving guards, and a growing army of freed species, who filled the corridors behind her like a rising tide. Ethan stepped back from Draxon and deactivated the blade, and turned to the Queen. "Your throne, Your Majesty," he said, and he bowed. Not the bow of a servant, but the bow of a soldier, reporting mission complete. Silthari walked past him to her throne, and stood before it. And she looked at the fallen warlord, and the shattered room, and the battle scene came. Impossible human who had done what her entire empire could not. And she understood, with a clarity that shook her to her core, that everything she had ever believed about strength was wrong. The fires burned for 3 days. Across the capital city of the Valari throne world, repair crews and medical teams worked without rest to pull survivors from collapsed buildings and restore power to darkened districts, and the smoke rose in black columns that could be seen from orbit, a reminder of how close the Dominion had come to destroying itself from within. Draxon was taken to the deepest cell beneath the palace, in chains forged from the same metal his own armor had been made from. And the irony was not lost on anyone. His conspirators were rounded up across the empire, one by one, as the evidence that Ethan had broadcast continued to echo through every military channel. Queen Silthari reclaimed her throne on the morning of the 4th day, standing before a battered court in a damaged throne room with cracks running through the ancient walls like veins, and she addressed what remained of her empire with the cold composure that her species expected of their leaders. Monarch. But inside, she was not the same. Something had shifted in her, not broken, not weakened, but fundamentally rearranged, like a bone that had been set at a new angle and would never quite fit the old shape again. The Valari High Council convened an emergency session within the week, and their first order of business was not the reconstruction of the capital, or the reorganization of the military, or the punishment of Draxon's remaining loyalists. Their first order of business was the human. "He must be destroyed," declared Councillor Vathos, a Valari whose exoskeleton had faded to a dusty gray with age. What he demonstrated in the palace is a threat beyond anything Draxon ever posed. A single specimen of this species dismantled our defenses, organized our subjugated populations into a fighting force, and defeated our most decorated warlord in single combat. If one human can do this, what could 1,000 do? What could 1,000,000 do? Creature must be eliminated before word spreads. Several councillors murmured their agreement, and the fear in the chamber was thick enough to taste, because they had all watched the security recordings from the palace. They had seen the human move through their warriors like water through stone, and it had shaken something deep inside them that they did not want to examine too closely. Silthari listened to their arguments in silence, and when the last councillor had finished speaking, she stood. "You wish to destroy him because you are afraid," she said, and her voice was not angry, but it carried a weight that pressed down on every shoulder in the room, and I understand your fear, because I felt it too. I stood behind that human while he fought through my own palace, and I watched him do things that should not have been possible for a creature with no natural weapons, and no armor, and no venom, and I was afraid. She paused, and let the silence build. "Was also wrong," she continued, "and so are you. We looked at this species and saw weakness because we measured them against ourselves. And by our standards, they are weak. They are small and soft and fragile, and they break easily, and they die young. But we made the mistake of believing that our standard was the only one that mattered. She stepped forward, and the counselors shrank back almost imperceptibly. That human did not survive because he was stronger than us. He survived because he thinks in ways we cannot predict, adapts to situations we cannot imagine, and refuses to accept defeat even when every rational calculation says he should. He turned our own palace into a weapon, our own subjugated species into an army, and our own arrogance into a trap, and he did it all while we were laughing at him. She let that sink in. Destroying him would be the act of cowards, and worse, it would be the act of fools, because his species is out there, billions of them, on a world we have not yet reached. And if we kill this one, and they find out why, we will not face one human, we will face all of them. The council chamber was very quiet. I will not destroy him, Sothari declared, and I will tell you what I will do instead. She summoned Ethan to her private audience chamber that evening, and he came without escort, walking through the palace corridors that still bore the scars of battle, past guards who stepped aside and lowered their eyes as he passed, not in disrespect, but in something closer to reverence. He entered the chamber and stood before the queen, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "What are you?" Sothari finally asked. It was the question that had been burning inside her since the night of the coup. Not his name, not his rank, not his mission, but the deeper question, the one that kept her awake in the dark hours, the one that made her look at the galactic star charts and wonder what else she had been wrong about. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. "We come from a world that tried to kill us every day we were alive," he said. "Our planet has extreme heat and extreme cold, and storms that flatten cities and oceans that swallow ships, and ground that shakes and splits open without warning. We share our world with predators that have claws and fangs, and venom and speed and strength, all the things we do not have. And for 200,000 years, every single one of those things tried to destroy us." He paused. "And we are still here." Sothari listened, and for the first time she did not hear quaintness or amusement in his words. She heard the quiet thunder of something vast and old and relentless. "We did not survive because we were the strongest," Ethan continued. "We survived because when something knocked us down, we got back up. When something outsmarted us, we learned. When something was faster, then us. We built traps. When something was bigger than us, we built weapons. We are not the deadliest species because of what we are born with. We are the deadliest species because of what we become when something tries to take away what matters to us." He met her eyes. "You looked at me and saw no claws, no armor, no venom, and you were right. We do not need them. We never did." The room was silent, except for the distant hum of repair drones working on the palace walls, rebuilding what war had torn apart. Sothari stood and walked to her desk and activated a holographic display that showed the Dominion species classification system, the tiered ranking that organized every known civilization by their perceived threat level and value, from Tier 1 at the top to Tier 9 at the bottom. She looked at the entry for humanity. Tier 9, lowest rank, classified as non-threatening, recommended for labor and domestic service. And she deleted. "I am issuing a new classification," she announced, "effective immediately. Humans are designated Tier Null." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Null means unranked," Sothari explained. "It means our system cannot contain what you are. It means you exist outside the framework, because no framework we have ever built is sufficient to measure your species." She turned to face him fully. "I am also offering you a position, not as a servant, not as a curiosity, not as a pet, as my strategic advisor, with a voice equal to any member of my council. The Dominion needs to change, and I need someone who sees what we cannot." Ethan did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was calm but firm. "I will accept," he said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "Every subjugated species that fought beside me during the coup is to be granted immediate freedom, full citizenship, full rights, full autonomy. The Dren, the Caliph, the Voss, all of them. They bled for your throne, and they deserve more than a return to servitude." Silthari studied him for a long time, and he could see the calculation behind her eyes. The political cost, the economic disruption, the precedent it would set, and he could see the moment she decided that the cost of refusing was higher. "Agreed," she said. "And all human captives in the Dominion are to be released immediately and unconditionally." "Agreed." Ethan nodded once, and something in his posture relaxed by a fraction. Not much, because soldiers who had survived what he had survived never fully relaxed, but enough to suggest that a weight had been lifted. The decree went out across the Dominion that same night, transmitted on every frequency to every world. The subjugated species of the Palace Uprising were free, humans were reclassified to Tier Null, and a new era had begun. The reactions were immediate and seismic. Where millions had lived under Volari occupation for generations, the news was met with stunned silence, followed by weeping in the streets. And Korvan, who had returned home as a war hero instead of a broken servant, stood before his people and told them the story of the human who had given him back his courage. On dozens of other worlds, subjugated species heard what had happened, and began to ask questions they had been afraid to ask for centuries. Questions about rights and freedom, and what was possible when someone refused to accept the story they had been told about themselves. And in the halls of the Volari High Council, admirals and generals looked at the star charts, showing the location of Earth, and quietly updated their strategic assessments. Because the planet that had been labeled harmless now had a new annotation in the files, one that simply read, "Do not engage." On the evening of the 7th day, Ethan stood on the palace balcony, overlooking the rebuilding capital, and the twin moons hung low and full in the sky, casting silver light across a city that was slowly coming back to life. Korvan joined him, leaning against the railing with a quiet contentment that looked strange and new on his scarred face. "Do you think they will ever truly accept us?" Korvan asked, looking out at the Volari citizens moving through the streets below. "The humans, the Dren, all of us. Do you think they will ever see us as equals?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the lights come on across the city, one by one, like stars being born. "They do not need to accept us," he said, and there was a faint smile on his face, not triumphant, not cruel, but the steady smile of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side still standing. "They just need to remember what happens when they underestimate us." Korvan laughed, a real laugh, deep and full, the kind of laugh that had not come out of a Dren throat in a very long time. Below them the city breathed and rebuilt and changed, and above them the stars burned cold and bright and infinite. And somewhere far away, on a small blue planet spinning at the edge of known space, 6 billion humans went about their ordinary lives, going to work and raising children, and arguing about small things, and loving each other, and breaking each other's hearts, and getting back up every single time they fell, completely unaware that across the galaxy, empires were learning to be afraid of them. Not because of what they could destroy, but because of what they refused to surrender. And that, in the end, was what made humanity the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known. Not strength, not speed, not weapons or armor or venom, but the simple, stubborn, unbreakable refusal to stay down. The stars had no idea what was coming, but they would learn.